Welcome to Eat, Sleep, Wine, Repeat, a podcast for all you wine lovers who, if you're like me, just cannot get enough of the good stuff. I'm Janina, your host, brand ambassador, wine educator and sommelier. So stick with me as we dive deeper into this ever-evolving, wonderful world of wine. And wherever you are listening to this, cheers to you. Hello, wine friends, and welcome to this special flashcard episode, a focused deep dive designed primarily for students preparing for the WSET Diploma D3 exam on the wines of the world. However, whilst this episode is especially useful for exam preparation, it's also for anyone who wants a clear, structured understanding of one of France's most important regions, and also just a chance to really geek out on the subject. And today we are exploring the Rhône Valley in detail, its grapes, terroirs, appellations, yields, and the key numbers you need to know. And I won't be covering absolutely everything. I'm working through what is required for the exam syllabus, and as with any wine region, each appellation could easily deserve its own episode. But by the end of this, you'll have a strong grasp of the differences between the Northern and Southern Rhône, their styles, grapes, and defining characteristics. Feel free to pause and reflect as we go, as I'll be asking questions along the way. Or if you'd simply like to listen and absorb, just let the audio run and enjoy the deep dive. So, when we talk about the Rhône Valley, we separate them into two regions. In fact, the Northern Rhône is separated by a gap of about 30 miles from the Southern Rhône. There's very little grapes growing in that little gap. Now, when we think about the Northern Rhône and Southern Rhône, they actually have two very different climates. So what are they? Northern Rhône is much more continental, whereas Southern Rhône is much more Mediterranean, and for that reason also the grape varieties are different. So in the Northern Rhône there is one principal red grape variety and a few whites. They are Syrah for red, and for the whites typically it's Viognier, Marsanne and Roussanne, whereas in the south, what are they? So for the reds, they're generally blends made up of Grenache Noir, Syrah, Cinsault and Mourvèdre, whereas with the whites, they're typically blends with Grenache Blanc, and there are a lot more other whites, which we will cover in a second. Now you have the River Rhône that runs through both the northern and the southern regions. But when we think about the Northern Rhône, where are the vines planted? So they are typically much closer to the river. The vines are planted on slopes. And so therefore, depending on the winding path of the river, this creates a range of different aspects. Whereas it's very different in the Southern Rhône, with a vast vineyard area with extensive plantings. In fact, in the south, we're looking at 65,000 hectares compared to the north, which is only 4,200. And you're going to find the plantings are widely distributed across really a broad landscape. So many vineyards planted much further away from the river. Now, the Northern Rhône is mainly made up of specific individual crus, whereas when we go to the south, of course, they have their crus too, Châteauneuf-du-Pape being one of the largest. However, the Southern Rhône provides the large volumes of basic Côte-Rôtie, AOC and the IGP wines. If you look at Interrhône figures of 2021, the appellations Côte-du-Rhône, AOC, and Côte-du-Rhône Village, so the next step up, together they produce about 60% of the total wines of Rhône Valley. And if we are looking at AOC wines, what do you think the percentage is between red, white and rosé? Probably you're not surprised that more red is made. We're looking at about 76% red, 14% rosé, which actually is quite surprising to me, and 10% white. I thought there'd be more white. Now, keeping that in mind, what do you think the most planted grape varieties are in order? Well, you again may not be surprised that the winner is Grenache Noir, followed by Syrah. And then in order goes Mourvèdre, Cinsault, Grenache Blanc, Viognier, Clairette, Roussanne, and then Marsanne. So let's look at all of the grape varieties, and I am just going to make my life very simple and read from the WSET textbook exactly how they describe it. So first of all, Grenache Noir. How would you describe it in terms of yields, vigour, how it likes to be trained, its weaknesses, and what does it taste like? Okay, so Grenache Noir is high yielding as a variety and it needs a warm climate. It loves the sunshine to ripen. It ripens late and therefore can be affected by early autumn rains. It's got upright growth, so it makes it really suitable to be trained as a bush vine, so also known as goblet. And if it's pruned short, that's going to contain its vigour, and it does well on dry, low fertility soils. It has a really good drought resistance, but it is prone to coulure. And if you're not sure what coulure is, this is a flowering failure in grapevines that results in poor fruit set. So it means that the flowers don't successfully develop into berries. And this could happen because the conditions in late spring are cold, they're wet, they're windy, and although we are talking about Mediterranean climates down in the southern Rhône, Grenache is just relatively prone to it. It has these delicate flowering characteristics, and we've already talked about the fact that Grenache has high vigour naturally, and so if the vine is diverting too many resources to shoots and leaves rather than fruit set, that also increases coulure risk. So if that happens, then you have an issue with reduced yields. You've also got fungal diseases such as downy mildew, phomopsis, and botrytis bunch rot. It is also prone to bacterial necrosis or bacterial blight, which is a disease that kills leaves and shoots and eventually the plant. Poor Grenache. Well, the disease is combated by planting only disease-free stock and avoiding contamination from pruning tools. Now, the grapes, they can accumulate high sugar levels rather quickly, which can be an issue in dry wines, but it does make it very suitable for producing vin du natural. And it typically forms the major component in southern Rhône blends that may also include Syrah, Mourvèdre, Cinsault, and other varieties. So it will contribute a pale ruby colour, ripe red fruit, so think strawberries, red plum, red cherry, little spiciness, a little herbal notes, high alcohol, low to medium tannins, and a lower acidity. So what about Syrah? Well, this is also a vigorous variety that needs careful training and tying in to protect it from the Mistral wind. We'll talk about that in a second, but this blows in the north and southern Rhône. Now, on the steep slopes of the top northern Rhône appellations, individual plants are often tied to one or two poles, as trellising is it's not possible. And that, of course, adds to the cost. It is susceptible to mites and to botrytis bunch rot. In addition to common diseases, there is also a disease called Syrah decline, or disorder in which the leaves turn red, the graft point breaks up, and the vine dies. Syrah is the only black grape variety used in the Northern Rhône Crus, whose wines are typically deep ruby in colour, medium to pronounced intensity aromas and flavours of violet, plum, red plum in cooler years and cooler sites, whereas black plum in warmer years and the warmer sites. Then you might find blackberry with black pepper and herbal notes. Acidity and tannins range from medium to high. Syrah adds structure, fruit and colour to the southern Rhône blends. Now, what about Mourvèdre? So, This is a late budding and a late ripening variety that only thrives in warm to hot climates. It needs high temperatures at the end of the season to ripen fully, and therefore can be underripe if the late summer isn't hot enough. It is actually not drought resistant, and it does require small but regular amounts of water. So, for example, from deep calcareous soils that store water, that works really well. It's best pruned short and can be grown either with a cordon system or on bush vines. It only produces low yields. It is prone to mites, leaf hoppers, and sour rot. So that's a disease that affects ripening bunches due to insect or bird damage to grapes, which then become prone to bacteria and fungi. In the winery, it is strongly prone to reduction, and therefore care has to be really taken to make sure the must has adequate access to oxygen, and it is typically aged in old oak, which adds a small amount of cost. So you're going to find Mourvèdre nearly always as part of a blend in the Rhône, and Mourvèdre, it contributes this deep ruby colour, intense aromas of blackberries, blueberries and violets, this high alcohol and high firm tannins. But by contrast, it is the principal variety in the red and rosé wines of Bandol, AOC in Provence. So now on to Cinsault, and this is the last one we're going to talk about for the Rhône Valley, even though other varieties like Carignan are also planted here. But Cinsault. Well, Cinsault is late budding and it is high yielding. It has a good drought and heat resistance. To produce the highest quality wine, though, yields do need to be restricted. If it's grown on soils with excessive lime, it can suffer from chlorosis. It is prone to esca and eutypa dieback. So these are both fungal trunk diseases, and also to mites and to grape moths. Now, in the Southern Rhône, Cinsault is typically used as a small part of the red blend. It is typically made in a way that preserves its fruit flavours. So a winemaker may typically ferment the wine in stainless steel at a medium range temperature. Now, Cinsault contributes this light ruby colour, medium to medium plus intense aromas of fresh red fruit, so raspberries, red cherries, high alcohol and low to medium tannins. The lifted aromas of the variety are most prominent in the first year after the wine is made, making it highly suitable for early drinking reds and rosés. So let's do exactly the same thing for the white wines, starting with Viognier. So this is an early budding white variety, and so therefore it is prone to spring frost. It is normally grown on a trellis or on poles to prevent wind damage. Yields tend to be low and unpredictable due to poor flowering and fruit set, so couleur again, and picking must be judged very accurately as the fruit needs to be fully ripe to have its typical pronounced aromas. However, if the grapes are left too long, they lose flavour and acidity and rapidly gain sugar, and then that results in a very unbalanced wine that then lacks flavour. What Viognier should give is medium lemon in colour with pronounced aromas and flavours of honeysuckle, apricot, peach, with medium to high alcohol and low acidity. Oh, and fun fact time, what is the maximum percentage of Viognier that is allowed in some Northern Rhône red wines that, of course, otherwise would be made with 100% Syrah? The answer is 20%. Okay, so what about Marsanne? This is a late budding white variety, so the opposite to Viognier, and so actually that helps it avoid spring frosts. It is vigorous and productive. To produce high quality wines, yields must be kept low to reduce the amount of fruit being ripened. It performs best on stony and low fertility soils. Low fertility keeps the yields low, and therefore it does well on the slopes of the Northern Rhône Valley. Now it's prone to powdery mildew, mites, and another one, botrytis bunch rot. The wines are medium lemon in colour, sometimes gold, with low intensity honeysuckle, lemon and apricot fruit, an oily texture, medium acidity, full body, and medium to high alcohol. Now, in the Northern Rhône, it can either be made as a varietal wine or blended with Roussanne. And in the Southern Rhône, it is just usually part of a blend. So let's go to Roussanne. Just like Marsanne, this is also a late budding white variety, and it grows best on low fertility, well-drained soils. It has a really poor resistance to wind, and so therefore sites must be chosen carefully. It is variable in the amount of fruit it produces due to, here we go again, couleur, and is very susceptible to powdery mildew, botrytis bunch rot, and mites, which lowers the yields, requires additional work in the vineyard, and both of which add to cost. It is more difficult to grow successfully than Marsanne, so Marsanne is easier, and therefore you're going to find less of it grown in the Rhône Valley. Now the wine is medium lemon in colour, sometimes gold, medium to medium plus intensity with aromatics of pear with herbal notes, medium to medium plus acidity, and medium to high alcohol. Roussanne is similar in colour and structure to Marsanne, but the wines tend to age quicker. And in the Rhône Valley, it is normally blended with other varieties, especially Marsanne in the Northern Rhône, and Claret, Grenache Blanc in the Southern Rhône, although you can find single varietal wines are made in both. Okay, we have 3 more whites to cover. So what about Grenache Blanc? This white variety, it's relatively early budding, but this is only occasionally a problem with spring frost as it is mainly grown in the mild south of France and in Spain. So it has a good wind resistance. And for other grape growing issues, go back to Grenache Noir as they suffer from the same. Now in the Rhône, it is grown almost exclusively in the southern part, where it is mainly used to produce dry white blends and also a little vin du natural, where its tendency to reach high potential alcohol levels is actually a benefit. It contributes low intensity ripe green fruit and some floral notes, high alcohol and low acidity. Now to Claret. This is a vigorous white variety. It grows well in low fertility dry soils and is therefore well suited to the southern Rhône and its lower rainfall. So to contain the vigour, it needs to be pruned short and excessive buds removed, but it grows very upright and has the advantage of being relatively wind resistant without staking. It ripens late and therefore can be prone to early autumn rains. It needs careful handling in the winery as it oxidizes easily. This variety principally goes into white blends in the Southern Rhône. It adds freshness and fruit with white flower, fennel, apple and grapefruit notes. It has high alcohol and low to medium minus body. And the last grape we are going to cover is Beaujolais. So what about this grape variety? Well, it is late ripening and it has loose bunches and a thick skin. So that gives it resistance to botrytis bunch rot, giving it the disease resistance necessary for late ripening. It grows well in warm, dry locations and hence is well suited to the conditions in the Southern Rhône. Now the wine is typically used in white Southern Rhône blends and it's going to contribute lemon flavour, medium plus acidity, and a medium alcohol. Right, let us now look at the appellations of the Northern Rhône. Now, we said that the climate is continental, but is it cool climate? Is it moderate? What is the name of the wind, and what is the benefit to that wind? So the answer is it is a moderate continental climate. So you get these cold winters, you get warm summers, and adequate rainfall, but that falls mainly in the autumn and the winter. And the name of the wind is the Mistral, which is a cold wind, and it blows from the north. And the positive is it reduces the incidence of those fungal diseases that we talked about many of the grapes suffer from. It also decreases vine vigor, which leads to lower yields and higher concentration in the wines. But of course, that means lower production. And what about these steep slopes? What's the positive and the negative? Well, as you know, most of the better vineyards, they are planted on these steep slopes, and with that there is better drainage and sun exposure, but this does mean most vineyards are picked by hand, and then that increases costs. Right, what is the most northerly AOC? Right at the top we have Côte-Rôtie. This is home to those iconic single vineyards, the La wines, La Mouline, La Lalande, La Turque from Guigal, and you also have the traditional cult producer, Domaine Jamais. Now, does the appellation produce any white wine? The answer is no. This is just a red wine appellation. However, Viognier can be in the blend. What is the maximum percentage? Well, it is here that a producer can use 20% Viognier. However, that is not normal. Most of the time it is 0 or a small percentage. And when both grape varieties are used, they must be co-fermented. Winemaking emphasizes the aromatic potential of the wines, with most choosing to destem and then cold soak the fruit. But the use of a percentage of stems in the ferments is increasingly common. Warm fermentation temperatures are typical for full extraction. Where Viognier is used, it adds floral and fruity aromas. Now here they often use natural yeasts because the idea this will give a greater perceived terroir expression. Maturation in either 225 litre barriques or larger wooden vessels, and stylistically, the wines are known for their pronounced aromas and are typically softer and less full-bodied than the wines of other top appellations such as Hermitage and Cornas. Now, quickly getting back out into the vineyards, how are the vines trained? There is a very specific training on poles that Côte-Rôtie is quite well known for, along with their single and double Guyot trained vines. What is that called? It is called échalas. So this is individual wooden stakes, and that's because of the region's extreme topography and the traditional farming methods. So steep slopes, the vineyards are often very steep and they are terraced, and most of the vineyards are facing east and southeast. So this allows them to see more sun, but also shelters them from the winds coming from the north. But this is a region that is going to give you fully ripe grapes due to the high levels of sunshine and heat, the rapid drainage because of the steep slopes, and poor stony soils. Of course, already mentioned, most of the work has to be done by hand, and one of the biggest issues being on a slope is erosion. That is a constant problem. Now, what is the typical planting density and the maximum allowed yield? Well, planting densities are 10,000 vines per hectare if we're talking about typically planted vineyards. That's to create competition between the vines and then reduce the yields and produce concentrated fruit in the wines. The vines are also most commonly propagated by mass selection, and there is a preferred rootstock for you rootstock geeks out there. What is it? Well, apparently in Côte-Rôtie, they prefer to use rootstock 3309. This is a rootstock that helps control vigour. Now, what is the next appellation below Côte-Rôtie? And you get extra points for also naming the very tiny 3.5 hectare appellation that is owned by one estate. So the appellation is the same name as the producer. And the answer is, we are talking about the Condrieu appellation, and the small, tiny estate and appellation is Château-Grillet. And what is the grape variety that grows here? Just one, and we are talking about Viognier. So, what are the maximum yields of Condrieu? What is the geography like? And how does that affect the wine? So, low maximum yield of 41 hectolitres per hectare. And that is going to give you that medium to pronounced flavour intensity. The river turns southwest at this point. So what that means is that most of the vineyards are south facing, so you're going to have extra enhanced fruit ripening, and the vines, no surprise, are grown on steep, low fertility, rocky slopes, often in terraced vineyards. And again, like Côte-Rôtie, soil erosion is a problem. Now, what do the winemakers do in the winery in terms of oak, no oak, malolactic fermentation, yes or no? The style of Viognier that typically comes out of Condrieu appellation is fermentation in stainless steel tanks or large wooden vessels. So a few producers are using more expensive small barrels, so those wines would have enhanced texture. Now, when it comes to converting the malic acids to lactic acids, most will carry this out, but it does depend on the vintage. Now, wines are typically aged on the lees for up to about 12 months, and they will often do lees stirring, and that will also add to the texture. Now, on to the next appellation. Now, this is the longest appellation, and it runs from Condrieu to Cornas. So this is nearly the entire length of the Northern Rhône, which is 30 miles long. So what is the name of this appellation? It is Saint-Joseph. Now, the historical heart you can find in the southern part of the region, because since 1994, the appellation was extended, and this included some sites not on hillsides that typically don't produce as high quality wines. Now, there has been debates as to whether to reduce the appellation and limit it to hillside slopes only, but so far, this is what we've got. Top producer you may have heard of, Jean-Louis Chave, is to be found here. Now, do they make red or white wines here? Well, they make both. However, 90% of the wines are red, and very much like in Côte-Rôtie, same maximum yield, which is 40 hectolitres per hectare. Now, can they allow white grapes in with their red wines? Well, actually, it's quite rare to include the white grapes, but they are allowed. So that is Marsanne and Roussanne in small proportions. So what is the main winemaking style here? Well, it is varied because quality goes from mid-price, good wines, all the way up to premium and super premium. But this is an area where you can get very good value. There's a lot of stainless steel and large wooden tanks used for fermenting and aging in larger wood or tank or large barrels, but of course occasionally barriques are used too. Now, if we jump to the other side of the river, what are the two appellations? Well, we talked about Saint-Joseph being the longest. This is the largest. And the largest is Crozes-Hermitage. And within Crozes-Hermitage is the premium, well-known Appellation Hermitage. So let's start with Crozes-Hermitage on the left bank of the Rhône River. How many hectares does this appellation have? The answer is 1,700. And there really is a difference between the northern part and the southern. This is again another region that was extended back in 1956. So what is the difference between the northern part and the southern? Well, in the northern part, you have steeper slopes and you have more of this alpine influence. There's also a strong influence from the Mistral, quite a lot of high diurnal range, but this results in wines of moderate sugar accumulation and retained acidity. The southern sector is more temperate, although there can be heavy rainfall in the late autumn and through the winter, and the flatter vineyards are in the south. So this used to be an area dominated by orchards and farmsteads, and it does mean on that flatter land they are able to machine harvest, which does reduce costs. Now, as a general rule in Crozes-Hermitage, the soils are just deeper and more fertile than they are in Hermitage, and this does result in wines that have a lower concentration. But what is their maximum yield? It's actually restricted to 45 hectolitres per hectare when we compare it to the other red areas of 40. So it probably comes as no surprise that this is a region that produces mid-priced good to very good wines. However, if you are looking for a premium priced high quality wine, Jabolet with their Domaine de Thalabert is a good option to go for. Now, what is the wine making like typically in Crozes-Hermitage? Well, carbonic and semi-carbonic maceration were often used in the past to enhance fruitiness for wines that were meant to be drunk young, but this is becoming less and less done. Traditional fermentation on the skins is common in wines intended to be aged. Destemming is widely practiced, with fermentation mainly in concrete tanks or stainless steel, and maturation in these tanks or large oak vessels. Now, white wines can be made in this area. What's the percentage of the production? Only about 9%. And they are going to be made from what grapes? Well, Marsanne and Roussanne, with more of the wines being made from Marsanne. Most of them aged in old wood, but some of the more premium stuff is aging in new barrels. Now to Hermitage. This is probably the most famous of all the Northern Rhône appellations, and it's actually named after the 12th century crusader and latterly hermit Gaspard de Sturenberg. So this is a very small appellation. What size in hectares is it? It is only 137 hectares. It's virtually all planted, and 1/3 of the vines have been devoted to white wine production. Now, this is a place that is known for its super high quality premium wines. What is the climate like, the geography, and the effect it has on the ripening of the grapes? Well, we already know this is the hill of Hermitage, and these slopes are facing south, so they are catching all of the sun, and they have protection from cold winds. So you have these hot, dry vineyards. They are on thin, stony soils, and this just really results in wines that have this pronounced flavour intensity, high tannins, and red wines that can really age. And the most famous climats for Syrah are on the western end of the hill, and that is where there are the highest temperatures. Now, again, erosion is a constant problem, with quite a lot of the vineyards having to be terraced, and that also means much of the vineyard work has to be done by hand, raising the costs. I think you can probably guess the maximum yields for the reds. 40 hectolitres per hectare. For the whites, 45 hectolitres per hectare. Now, talking of whites, I'm sure you can probably guess the grapes. It's typically a blend of a majority Marsanne with some Roussanne or just pure Marsanne. Now, the styles often of these whites are quite rich and creamy and nutty, and it really does depend on the winemaker and his style. But yes, they can use stainless steel tanks for fermentation or maturation, but many are using barrels, many are using new barrels. There's often lees aging for up to 12 months. So these are whites that very often can age for quite some time. Now back to the reds, these are Syrahs that are really some of the world's most structured and long-lived Syrahs. And if you're looking for some decent examples, Chapoutier and Jabelet are certainly producers to look towards. And for winemaking, I mean, this is a place where they are often using stems, especially in ripe vintages. They are choosing warmer fermentation temperatures to extract more. They are often spending time in oak for maybe 12 to 18 months. Very often new oak is used. So these are some serious wines. Now, for an extra point, in very ripe years, there is a rare wine made. It is a sweet wine made by drying the grapes off the vine. What is this called? It's called vin de paille, which translates to straw wine. And the most famous typically come from a different region, Jura. But yes, on certain vintages, you will be able to find a vin de paille Hermitage. Now we have two more appellations left in the Northern Rhône. One is for red wine production, the other is for white. What are they called? We have Cornas for red, and then Saint-Péray is the appellation which is the most southerly of the Northern Rhône, and this is dedicated to white wines. So let's look at Cornas. How would you describe the climate and its geography? Well, Cornas has this natural south and east facing amphitheatre with some steep slopes. There is a warm Mediterranean climate. There is good protection from cold winds, and the excellent aspect means that it is often the first Syrah to be picked in the Northern Rhône. Now, can there be any white wine in this blend? With a Cornas, no, it is 100% Syrah. And do you want to take a guess about the maximum yields? I feel like you can do it. If you guessed 40 hectolitres per hectare, you would be correct. This is also a really small appellation. If you were thinking 145 hectares, then you would be correct. Now, stylistically, the wines here, there is a trend to go back to robust, long-lived wines. These are wines that have a reputation for tannic intensity. Many producers are aging their wines in small barrels. And this is certainly a region that is going to give you wines from very good to outstanding quality. Lots of premium and super premium wines are made in Cornas. Now, Saint-Péray, you know this is a white wine appellation, so it goes as no surprise that the grape varieties used here are Marsanne, which accounts for the vast majority of plantings, with some Roussanne. And there seems to be a pattern on maximum yields for white, so we're looking at 45 hectolitres per hectare. Now, let's talk about climate, what makes it different from many of the other appellations. This is a slightly cooler appellation. The vines are grown on limestone and granitic soils. There is good water holding capacity and drainage. And for winemaking, the wines could be fermented in stainless steel or in barrels, and higher quality wines typically are aged on the lees for 10 to 12 months. And you can also get sparkling wines from here that are made with Marsanne and Roussanne as well. This is a place where you can typically get good to very good in quality and mid to premium priced wines. And finally, there's an IGP to know about called Collines, Rhodenien. And this translates to Hills of the Rhône. This is an IGP that can make red, white, and rosé wines. These are made from the grapes that are grown outside of the AOCs in the Northern Rhône. They are allowed higher yields, so maximum is 80 hectolitres per hectare, and this allows the producers to make wines from other grape varieties than those allowed by the AOC rules, and for top producers in the Northern Rhône crew to offer less expensive wines than their AOC wines, typically mid to premium priced. Right, let us do this. Go take a break if you need to. We are now heading to the Southern Rhône, and let us focus on climate. Warmth, rainfall, winds, how does this affect irrigation? Well, as you already know, down in the Southern Rhône, it is a Mediterranean climate. It is a warm Mediterranean climate. And so there are mild winters, very warm, dry summers, and there is some rainfall. However, drought is becoming a bigger issue. And if the drought is severe, then irrigation is permitted. Now, in terms of the land, it is much flatter in the south. This also means a lot less protection from the Mistral wind. So, for this reason, the vines are trained often in a specific way. What is that? You will often find low bush trained vines, and this is ideal for varieties such as Grenache Noir, which is the most planted grape variety in the south. However, this is actually quite different to how Syrah is trained, which is often tied to wires on trellises, and that is to give it protection from the wind. So what is the hierarchy of appellations in the Southern Rhône? Well, it starts with Côtes-du-Rhône, AOC, then Côtes-du-Rhône Village, AOC, then you have Côtes-du-Rhône Village, AOC, plus the named village. Currently, there are 22 villages, and an example of how that might be labelled, Côtes-du-Rhône Village, AOC, Séguret. Now, then after that are the individual appellations for the top villages of the Southern Rhône, and these are known as crus. So examples would be the famous Châteauneuf-du-Pape, AOC, Gigondas, AOC, Cairanne, AOC. But then you also have some other appellations within the Rhône that are outside of this hierarchy, such as Ventoux. Now, all AOCs have their own requirements in terms of yields and grape varieties. In terms of red wines, if we were to exclude Châteauneuf-du-Pape right now, what is the AOC regulations typically regarding the blend? Well, for most AOCs, the red wines are Grenache Noir dominant blends with Mourvèdre and Syrah, along with other permitted varieties such as Carignan and Cinsault. Now, if we dive a little bit deeper, let's look at the requirements for Côtes-du-Rhône AOC. The maximum yield for red, rosé and white are actually all the same. What are they? So it is 51 hectolitres per hectare. And you already know the principal red grape varieties. We've touched on them. Grenache Noir, Mourvèdre, Syrah. But they have to make up a specific minimum percentage of the blend. What is that? So those three principal grape varieties have to be at least 60% of the final blend. But if the grapes come from the Southern Rhône, which basically nearly always they do, because although Côtes-du-Rhône can include the Northern Rhône, normally the producers in the north can sell their wines under a more valuable appellation. So, keeping in mind these grapes are most likely coming from the south, Grenache Noir has to be a minimum of 30% in the blend, and the combination of Mourvèdre and Syrah needs to be a minimum of 20%. But what about white wines? What is the principal varieties there? So you have Beaujolais, Clairette, Grenache Blanc, Marsanne, Roussanne and Viognier. And together, all of these white grape varieties need to make up what percentage of the final blend of a white Côtes-du-Rhône? they need to be at least 80%. Now, if we look at Côte-du-Rhône Village, for their red blends, they are pretty much the same. However, instead of the 3 principal grape varieties making up a minimum of 60%, they must be at least 66%, and at least 2 of the 3 principal varieties used. But Grenache Noir must be included. And in terms of maximum yields, it is slightly smaller. And then smaller again for a village wine with a named village. Do you know what they are? So for Côte-du-Rhône Village, it is 44 hectolitres per hectare, but it is 41 hectolitres per hectare for a Côte-du-Rhône Village with named village. And if we are going on to the Crus, it is lower again. So with Châteauneuf-du-Pape, their maximum yield is 35 hectolitres per hectare and 36 to 38 hectolitres per hectare in the red wines of the other villages. Now, how do you describe a Côte-du-Rhône in terms of the way it will look in the glass, smell, taste? Well, it is typically medium intensity ruby, medium intensity red plum and blackberry fruit, no oak flavours, medium acidity, medium tannin, or low tannin if it was made by carbonic maceration, medium alcohol, and the wines are typically good quality and inexpensive in price. Now let us go to the cru wines and start with Gigondas AOC. So what is the climate like? How is it different to be given that name of a cru, and how does that affect the wine? So Gigondas got its appellation status granted in 1971. It has vineyards up to 600 metres above sea level, and it is in part shaded by the Dentelle de Montmirail mountains, and that reduces the temperatures in the mornings. So this extends the period of maturation and increases the flavours in the resulting wine. So the slightly lower temperature and the cooling effects of the Mistral have become increasingly valued, as Grenache Noir in the warmer temperatures of recent decades has resulted in higher alcohol wines. Now the final blend here is based on the principal variety Grenache Noir, at least 50%, and at least 1 of Syrah or Mourvèdre. And what was the changes from 2023? Well, since then, Gigondas has been able to release a white wine. And what is the main grape variety? It is Clairette, and the minimum percentage in the blend needs to be 70%. So let's head over to Vacqueyras and do the same. Altitude, temperatures, how is it different? Well, this AOC was granted in 1990. It is not quite as high as Gigondas. It's rising to about 440 metres, giving diurnal variation but not threatening ripeness in cooler years. Small amounts of white and rosé wines are made within the AOC. The final blend here is based on principal variety Grenache Noir, at least 50%, and at least 1 of Syrah or Mourvèdre. Now, these 2 appellations I've talked about, they make wine that is typically good to very good in quality and mid to premium priced. Now, what about Vinsobres AOC? Where is it in terms of location, and how does that affect it? This is the most northerly of the Southern Rhône crus, and it was promoted to being a separate AOC in 2006. Like most of the Southern Rhône crus, it had previously been a named village within Côte-du-Rhône Village AOC. Now, interesting fact on grape varieties planted here that's maybe slightly different to some of the other cru wines. What is it? Well, it is still predominantly planted to Grenache Noir. However, in recent decades, more Syrah has been planted and grown. So this contributes flavour, intensity, structure and colour. Now, the wines are exclusively red. I'm sure you can probably assume the blend. It needs to be based on Grenache Noir, at least 50%, and at least 1 of Syrah or Mourvèdre. Well, what about the altitude here? The vineyards are on south and southeast facing slopes of 200 to 500 meters. This results in good sunlight interception, good drainage, and some protection from the Mistral wind. So with the higher slopes, they are cooler. This lengthens the period of ripening and increases the flavour intensity. Now, they also have some older plots of Carignan and Sanso, which are increasingly valued for their high quality fruit. And Vinsobres is known for making wines good to very good in quality and medium to premium priced. However, with more medium priced than premium priced wines. Let's go to Rasteau, AOC. And this is actually an appellation that also makes Vin du Natural. But for its red wines, it was promoted to AOC status in 2010. Now, what is the climate like here and how does that affect the wines? So the vines are planted on low, south-facing slopes around 100 meters in a warm enclave. So they're sheltered from the Mistral. This results in ripe, full-bodied wines. As elsewhere in the warmer parts of France, irrigation is allowed here within the limits set. And blend, what do we think it is? Well, no surprise, the final blend here is based on Grenache Noir, at least 50%, with at least one of Syrah or Mourvèdre. And in terms of how the wines are made, most of them are fermented in large vats, especially concrete, and matured in large oak vessels. Some higher quality Syrah is aged in small barrels with, of course, an additional cost. And the wines are typically good to very good in quality and medium to premium priced. What about the appellation Cairanne? This was a new appellation created in 2015 and climatically, where does this region sit and style-wise? Well, it's not as steep as Gigondas or as warm as neighbouring Rasteau. It produces mainly red wines, but in a very fruity and approachable style. The final blend is based on Grenache Noir, but slightly different. 40% has to be Grenache Noir. And then, of course, at least one of Syrah or Mourvèdre. And a small amount of white wine is also produced here that has a reputation for very high quality. Okay, let us go to Beaumes-de-Venise, AOC, best known for its Vin du Natural. However, this AOC has included unfortified still red wine since 2005. Now, the main things to know are that most of the vineyards are planted on slopes and some slightly shaded by the Dentelle de Montmirail. Now, do you know what the final blend here is? Well, it's based on Grenache Noir, which with Syrah must together make up the 50% of the blend. So that's the slight difference there. Right, now on to Châteauneuf-du-Pape. This is a very historic village, and the appellation name actually comes from being the summer residence of the Pope in the 14th century when the papacy had been relocated to the nearby city of Avignon. It's also historic in the sense that in 1923, Baron de Roy of Château-Fortier drew up a set of rules, the prototype for the first AOC in France, to protect the name from being used by others outside of the region, which was initially approved in 1936. And this is when it was stipulated the use of how many grape varieties. So, the use of 13 grape varieties are permitted, however 18 if you count the colour variants of 5 of them. And along with that, a minimum alcohol level of 12.5% ABV without chaptalization, which at the time was actually very challenging. The appellation allows red and white wines to be made. What are the percentages? Well, more than 90% of the wines produced are red and the remaining white. And what are the principal grape varieties allowed to be used in these wines? So for the red wine, principally Grenache Noir, Mourvèdre, Syrah, and for the white wines, Grenache Blanc, Clairette, Bourbon, and Roussanne. However, Marsanne and Viognier are not permitted in this AOC. Now here also Mourvèdre is getting more attention because of its intense black fruit, but it can only succeed where there is sufficient moisture in the soils. All the grapes need to be picked by hand, and the interesting thing about Châteauneuf-du-Pape is there is no stipulation of principal varieties and minimum percentages to be used, so it is actually possible to make single varietal wines. One example would be Château de Beaucastel's Châteauneuf-du-Pape Roussanne Vieilles Vignes, so Vieilles Vignes means old vines. Now this is a pretty large AOC. How many hectares? Well, there is more than 3,000. And how do we describe the soils, which are quite iconic here, and how does it affect the wines? Well, the soils are limestone, clay, sandstone, and sandy soils. The clay content being particularly helpful in its water holding capacity in a region with very dry summers. In fact, in 2021, 27% of the vineyard was certified organic. Low fertility and generally fast draining soils are highly suitable for growing vines and for reducing vegetative growth, leading to smaller crops of ripe grapes. Average yields for the decade to 2021 are just under 30 hectolitres per hectare. Now, there's the famous large pebbles, galets roulés, which radiate heat at night, adding to the warming effect. Now, in the past, this warming effect was really valued, but it is less so now as a warming climate is contributing to higher sugar levels. Now, if they are making wines from more of the sandy soils, it's believed that typically the wines are finer and lighter in style, whereas for more structured wines, the grapes are grown on soils with the large pebbles. How would you describe red Châteauneuf-du-Pape in terms of colour, aromas, intensity, flavours? So it is medium ruby in colour, medium plus to pronounced intensity of ripe red plum and blackberry fruit with spice notes and sometimes new oak notes. The wines have medium acidity, high alcohol, and tannins vary from medium minus to high, depending on varietal mix, winemaking style, and vintage. Because of the size of the appellation and the number of producers, there is a range of quality, but the majority are good to outstanding in quality and mid-priced to super premium. And with the white wines, there is definitely a trend to make lighter wines more floral and fresher in style. However, high quality wines may be fermented in oak barrels for additional complexity, but it is a personal choice whether the wines are matured either in tanks or oak barrels, and if they use a proportion of new oak. So to Lirac, this is a long established AOC, and it lies where in comparison to Châteauneuf-du-Pape? It is just across the river and makes mainly red wines. However, some rosés, like neighbouring Tavel to the south, which we'll get to in a second, and white wines. In terms of the blend for a red wine, what are the requirements, grapes and minimum percentage? Well, principal varieties are Grenache Noir, Mourvèdre, Syrah and Sanso, which together must make up a minimum of 90% of the final blend. And here you get high sunlight hours and well-drained, infertile soils, and this just makes for really good conditions for growing and ripening grapes. Now to Tavel, which is unique in the Rhône Valley because it is dedicated to what? Rosé wine. The AOC lists how many grape varieties? Well, there are 12 principal grape varieties, black and white, but the final blend must include what grape variety? Grenache Noir. Now, none of the principal varieties must contribute more than 60%, with the rest being made up from the allowed 12 varieties. And the maximum yield is 46 hectolitres per hectare. How would you describe a Tavel rosé? Well, the wines are medium intensity, pink-orange in colour, much darker than most other rosés, with medium to medium plus intensity of strawberry and raspberry fruit, medium plus to full body, and medium alcohol, but at the top end of that band, so we're talking around 13.5%. And the wines are good to very good in quality and medium to premium priced. It is worth noting that with Provence becoming so popular, that some Tavel producers have made paler wines, but it is the classic deeper colour that remains the usual style. And these are incredibly gastronomic rosés. Now, this has been so much information. I am simply going to read from the book the last bit of information that you are required to know if taking your diploma exams. So for the other Rhône appellations, they're sometimes referred to as satellite appellations. They're surrounding the main Côte de Rhône growing areas in the Southern Rhône. There are 7 in total. The largest by production level are Côte-Rôtie, Grignan-les-Adhémar, Ventoux, and Le Buron. So Côte-Rôtie, AOC, this appellation lies between the Rhône and eastern Languedoc, and it is in effect the southwest limit of the Rhône wine region. The vines are grown on southwest facing slopes, making for good sunlight interception, and are ventilated by breezes from the Mediterranean. Half of the production is red wine, just over 40% is rosé, with a very small proportion of white wines. The principal varieties for red wine are Grenache Noir, Mourvèdre, and Syrah, which together or singly must make up a minimum of 50% of the final blend. The maximum permitted yield is 60 hectolitres per hectare, and recent decades have seen a movement from being dominated by cooperative wineries towards smaller, privately owned estates. Most wines are good to very good in quality and inexpensive to mid-price, with a few wines at premium prices. Grignan-les-Adhémar, AOC. This appellation is at the northern end of the Southern Rhône. It produces mainly red blends, minimum 50% of principal varieties Grenache Noir and Syrah, and in a slightly lighter style than the areas to the south at inexpensive and mid-priced points, plus white and rosé wines. Now, most wines are good to very good in quality and inexpensive to mid-price. Ventoux, AOC. So this large and increasingly planted appellation in the southeast of the Southern Rhône is on the southern and western slope below the high Mont Ventoux, an important cooling influence due to the altitude and cool air coming down from the mountain, giving freshness to the wines. Vines are grown up to 450 metres. Almost 54% of the production in 2021 was red wines, 40% rosé and 6% white wines. The principal varieties are Grenache Noir, Syrah, Mourvèdre, Carignan and Sancerre for red wines that together must be 50% of the final blend. And at least 2 varieties must be included, making a range of blends a possibility. The appellation allows up to 60 hectolitres per hectare maximum yield, leading to some wines with light concentration. The appellation exports about a quarter of its production, and cooperatives are very important. In the area, which also has a wave of new winemakers, most wines are good to very good in quality and inexpensive to mid-priced, with a few wines at premium prices. Now, Le Buron, AOC. This appellation is in the southeast of the Rhône Valley and borders onto Provence. Vines are planted on gentle slopes or flat land. The principal varieties are Grenache Noir, Syrah and Mourvèdre. The final blend must include at least 2 of these, which singly or together must make up a minimum of 50% of the blend. The maximum yield here for red wines is 55 hectolitres per hectare, and most wines are good to very good in quality and inexpensive to mid-price, with a few wines at premium prices. Now, to finish off, and I promise, really finish off, there are the IGP wines in the Southern Rhône. In addition to AOC wines, IGP may be made from Rhône varietals or international varieties. Thus, for example, in the department Gard, home to Costières de Nîmes AOC, Merlot is the third most grown variety and Cabernet Sauvignon the fifth most grown variety. Done! That is it. Shut the book. Shut your ears. Class dismissed. Well, that was a long episode. I hope it delivered real value and helped bring the Rhône into sharper focus. If you found it useful, please share it with a wine-loving friend or fellow student and leave a rating or a review. It genuinely helps the podcast grow. Now, next week, by popular demand, I'm joined again by Italian wine expert Ian D'Agata, and we will be diving into Brunello di Montalcino. Now, to finish us off, I've actually got a proverb for you, and it is, he who tastes knows. So, along with all the learning for the brain, make sure you keep training that palate and tasting wine. Until next Monday, wine friends, cheers to you.